Welcome to Econ Thoughts, the podcast of the Society of Professional Economists. I'm your host, Filippo Gaddo, and I'm recording here in London. And today I'm very pleased to have as guest Tera, Allas, who is Director of Research and Economics at McKinsey, where she leads research on the macroeconomic outlook, growth, and productivity. Welcome, Tera, to our show.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, Tera, for joining us today. And I think, obviously, in addition to the work that you're currently doing at McKinsey, you actually had a long and distinguished career in economics in many different roles, particularly between the private and the public sector. And in fact, we met, a bit of a disclaimer, we met kind of 20 years ago, more or less, in the British government in what was called at the time the Department of Trade and Industry, DTI. I'm pretty sure he had many different names and iterations since then. But in those days, obviously working on economic and energy policies as well. So it would be great if you can kind of, for the audience, considering we have a lot of professionals in the private sector, public sector, but also in academia and students as well, to understand a little bit your experience of working in the public and private sector. What are the differences and any kind of bit of advice for people developing their career in those fields?
Yes, of course. So just to fill in the picture with one little extra nuance. So when I graduated from university, and I actually went to university in Finland, so I did a master's in science in economics and engineering. So I actually more or less joined McKinsey directly. So I worked as what McKinsey calls generalist for about 10 years as a management consultant. So obviously using my economics skills and using my not really engineering skills, but like the numeracy and the sort of structured thinking that comes from that sort of background. And then I joined, as you say, the government economic service and was chief economist in various places, and then came back to McKinsey. And throughout that career, I would say that I've worked as an economist, applying economic tools and economic thinking and quantification of various types. But I have also had a much broader role in most cases. And the relevance, I think, for our listeners is that typically in any kind of role that you have as a professional economist, you end up needing a lot of other skills as well. And they are obviously analytical on one hand, but a lot of it is about communication skills, being able to translate what you're doing to other people who are not economists or not technically that deep into the topic matter. And part of it is also other skills like managing teams and managing people and managing projects so that you're delivering results when they're needed to be delivered and you know what the client, as it were, and that client could be an internal client or your boss, or it could be an external client. What is it they're looking for? What is the format in which they need it? How are they going to understand it? And how do they actually take action on the basis of it? Because at the back of my mind always throughout all of my jobs has been this idea of I want to have some impact. And it's actually harder than you'd think. You know, just writing down the right answer does not get you there. You need to build relationships. You need to communicate the results in a way that really speaks to the audience rather than the way you might want to communicate them. And then you need to convince people, and that's not necessarily that easy.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. You mentioned in there in terms of using kind of tools, and we might come back into a second to that, but how much actually economic theory, because one of the kind of my experience and some other people as well is how much economic theory do you actually really put in your day-to-day activity, whether it's in the public or private sector, and how much is obviously is applied kind of theory, but how much of it proper economics as opposed to more kind of high-level kind of business understanding of economics. How much was the theory involved, or it may different roles might have a different kind of quantity of it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Filippo. I would say that theory is involved in everything, in the sense that we all have mental models about how the world works. Both at McKinsey and in the civil service, the best way to solve analytical problems was and is a hypothesis-driven approach, in my opinion. Now, where are your hypotheses going to come from? Well, they come from your observations about the world and the data you're looking at, but also the theories that you were taught and your mental models. And so I would say there is not a single day in the last 35 years that I haven't thought about supply and demand. And trying to, and that theory of how, at a microeconomic level, how markets work works incredibly well to forecast and predict and explain prices in many cases, not always, but certainly in commodities. It is just the framework you use. Yeah. It's the theory as well as the practice kind of overlap a lot. If I think more about macro, then similarly, I guess when we're trying to explain and interpret what's happening in the macro economy, we look at some data about inflation or whatever. The best place to start is to say, well, what probably are the most likely reasons why inflation might have gone up or down? And then you can look at the data to see which ones of those hypotheses seem to bear out or not. So I don't see theory and practice, or theory and application and data, as separate things. They're very much overlapping. Now, of course, I'm talking here about the kind of theory that you learn in Economics 101. Yeah. And it is, it's broadly my experience that that's sufficient in many cases. You don't need to, well, it depends obviously on your job, but generally in a non-academic context, you tend not to need to go into some more deep or esoteric theoretical models. Yeah. But that may be necessary in some cases, and then that's what you would learn about in those specific cases.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting. You're absolutely right. It's a combination of the two. You talked about mental models and hypotheses. Have you changed over time? So is the mental model that you had 30 years ago the same that you would apply today to look at a macroeconomic kind of issue or topic?
So yes. And no. I think what has changed is I have become much more aware of some of the nuances and complexities. So a model is always a simplification of reality. And much of the time, that simplification doesn't matter. It's still a kind of reasonable model to explain the world. But especially, and I have done a lot of my work in micro rather than macroeconomics, you do need to understand the behavioral and cognitive bias issues often, because you can't explain people's behavior at a micro level always by just referring to supply and demand and utility maximization and those kinds of concepts. And this is particularly true, I think, also in the public sector. We theoretically can assume that people follow some kind of incentives, but in practice, they don't do it nearly as quickly or nearly as often or nearly as sort of deeply as the model would suggest. So that behavioral economics stuff has been an important nuance to the kind of broader economic models that we apply. And by the way, I think that's true in macro as well. Not so much at the kind of aggregate what's happening to the GDP, but you can definitely see how much confidence makes an impact in business behavior. Makes a huge difference to individual behavior and their purchasing and their consumption patterns. And it certainly makes a big difference to markets. And expectations, even though they're part of the original theory, they're sort of sometimes more important than you might think, and you can create interesting sort of bubbles and crashes through that. The final thing I would say is that last sort of 10, 15 years, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand productivity growth, and why is productivity growth so terrible in the UK, and why are productivity levels so low? And I think to understand that more deeply, we need to look inside the black box of the firm. We can't assume that firms are profit maximizing, utility maximizing, shareholder value maximizing units. And there are many reasons for that, not least because nobody does have perfect foresight. But these cognitive behavioral biases that impact on people, they impact on firms as well, because firms are made up of people. And decision makers, however much they try and reduce those biases in their processes and the data that they use, they are going to be subject to things like risk aversion or short-termism or inertia or herd behavior. And if we don't recognize those sort of nuances and sort of deviations from a very simple model of how firms behave, then I don't think we can explain why our productivity growth has been so low. Yeah. Just to give you a very specific example, we know that the main reason why our productivity levels are so low is because businesses and government don't invest enough in physical and intangible capital that would then help labor be more productive. And you have to ask yourself, well, why don't they invest? And the obvious answer is, well, maybe returns are just terrible, but the returns are not low. Like the Resolution Foundation has done interesting analysis and we've looked at it, and it's not true that the returns are not there. So something else is stopping business leaders, maybe their shareholders, maybe their bankers, from investing at what would be maybe societally a more optimal level. And some of that has got to do with things like risk aversion and things like short-termism, which are very much a kind of human feature as opposed to what the theory would suggest.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for pivoting to productivity. We definitely is one of the topics I wanted to discuss as well. I mean, and in fact, there was a famous quote from the late Robert Lucas that said, once you start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. For me, once you start thinking about productivity, it's hard to think about anything else in economics. That's the only thing that matters at the end of the day, especially with the demographics decline that you might experience in the next few years. But my question on productivity, you mentioned already about looking into the black box of the firm in the UK. What will be different in the UK black box of the firm compared to, for example, the United States? Because obviously it seems that the behaviors, humans are pretty much more or less the same. I appreciate there are cultural differences, obviously, and institutional differences. But what will be different to the British firm that might actually make it less productive in the last 10, 15 years compared to the competitors, whether it's in the US or even some countries in Europe, despite actually a lot of talk about the Eurozone crisis, they are actually more productive than their UK firms.
That's exactly right, Filippo. And there are a couple of different things. I will briefly mention, you mentioned cultural factors, and I do think that there is actually a difference in people's risk-taking appetite. Okay. And things like, and this is very anecdotal, but I think it makes the point that is fairly well documented, that the business culture in the US is one where going bankrupt is okay. Yeah. Then you just try again. In the UK, it's not, generally speaking, the average mentality of the average business person that it's okay to go bankrupt. And that has a big impact on risk-taking, innovation, business model change, and creative destruction. But let's put that to one side, because there's another very important factor, which is to do with leadership and management. And we can tackle that in multiple different ways. The evidence is best on what I would call management practices, kind of productivity enhancing management practices and processes. And we have less really good evidence on what I might call broader leadership, things like ambition, or things like, how do you create a vision for your business, and how do you make sure that your strategy is aligned with market forces? Those would tend to be important drivers of growth and productivity, but we don't have such a great evidence base. Where we have a really good evidence base is around structured management practices. The London School of Economics, the ONS, and various researchers in the US as well have done this work around management practices, and then looked at the impact of those on productivity, on growth, on innovation, on exports. And we find that there's a clear link from management practices to productivity. And a big chunk of the productivity gap between the UK firms and their US counterparts in the same sectors and in similar kind of size categories can be explained by the UK business. UK businesses on average being less well managed, according to these management practices. And particularly there being kind of a less beneficial distribution of those practices in UK firms. So if you look at the US curve distribution of management practices, there's quite a kind of chunky number of businesses towards the right-hand end of that distribution. So a large number of US businesses are very well managed. The UK, it's the other way around. We have a chunky part of the distribution in the kind of left-hand skew of the distribution curve, meaning that there are a large number of UK businesses and a large number of employees working in UK businesses who basically are in a pretty poorly managed environment. And I can say more about what we mean by good management practices in detail, but the bottom line is that because we have such a large chunk of our employees working in these sort of slightly less well-managed businesses and slightly less productive businesses, at the aggregate level, that results in very poor productivity performance.
Yeah, that's interesting. And to me, it connects a little bit your point about having a lot of badly managed companies to your earlier point about the bankruptcy and the fear of failure. And I think, and I'll point to a couple of works that I've kind of been looking at and reading recently. One of them, obviously, it was from kind of Ned Phelps, who in a book, Mass Flourishing, about 10 years ago, and then he actually did a couple of updates since. He talked a little bit about the decline of dynamism, which is related to a little bit about risk aversion and what kind of willingness actually to do something new. And then most recently, linked to that particular point, is Rashi Sharma, which he did in his book about what went wrong with capitalism. He pointed to, and in his view, about a bailout culture and an easy money culture as a way why people now kind of potentially, in a sense, kind of, they might not kind of take risks. So in a sense, they're actually going into the wrong. So there is a number of cultural. So I think, and then connected to your point of management, it might be that the badly managed company, they're not allowed to fail, or if they fail, they're bailed out. And so in a sense, you don't learn, because the markets are essentially information flow and mechanism in which if you fail, it means you've done something wrong, and then you change something different. But if you're not allowed to fail because the government or somebody bail you out, then there is no information, there's no learning, and you continue into kind of those kind of wrong, badly managed practices. Is this something that you've seen in the work you're doing in terms of actually having these kind of failing company being propped up in some way by other kind of cheap credit or even government money?
It is something we're seeing. It's probably a little bit more nuanced than that, and actually an area where I wish we had a lot more research going on, because the whole idea of creative destruction is, I think, absolutely central to the UK's productivity puzzle. But it's a concept that needs measuring from lots of different angles. And I think there is new research going in, but I think we also will want to see even more happen. So it's hard for me to directly comment on whether the exit barriers in the UK, for example, are too high and businesses are propped up. There's definitely evidence about that straight after the financial crisis. But what seems to be the case is that there are quite a lot of regulations where small businesses are exempt from them. There are quite a few tax policies where smaller businesses get a tax break. There are quite a few different ways in which smaller businesses, which tend to be worse managed, but it's not just an issue for small businesses, are sort of less vehemently part of a competitive market that would drive those kind of behaviors you mentioned around improving productivity and improving innovation and so on. So there is something there. I think there's something else. So that's a kind of almost like a stick argument. Businesses need some kind of threat of failure, or threat of existence in order to improve. I think there is something on the carrot side as well. And this may be more to do with cultural things, in the sense that quite a lot of businesses are quite happy not to grow and are quite happy to kind of sustain a level of lifestyle and income that they currently have, and not necessarily aspire to something bigger and better. And I'm not sure how we could create more demand for that kind of growth. But it would seem to be another important part of growing the economy in the aggregate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to your point about not wanting to grow, and it's a different situation in different countries, but I think both in France and in Italy, there is a little bit of a barrier around, if I remember well, I don't remember whether it was when you get to a 49 employees or 50, because the taxes actually, and you're subject to a lot of more regulation, higher taxation, and suddenly you could see that there is a lot of business that they have exactly 48, 49 employees. I don't know, it might be a different number, but there is this barrier, and suddenly nobody jumps over the 50 because they don't want to incur too many costs. And to me, that's more about regulation in some way, kind of hindering or kind of disrupting a little bit the normal kind of allocation of capital or allocation of resources because of some kind of barrier that is created by kind of government intervention to a certain extent, even if it was not necessarily the purpose of the government intervention in the first place.
Yes, exactly. I see those same charts and they're quite striking. You see this kind of cliff edge of number of businesses. I don't know, I haven't seen one for the UK. I guess we might have a more nuanced regime in some ways, but that doesn't mean there aren't those kinds of subtle effects going on. I also think one final hypothesis I have about the UK's poorly managed businesses is that we don't have the same kind of structure of apprenticeship as some other countries have for management skills. So dynamically, if you think about a person gets their first job in a business, and on average in the UK, if they were randomly allocated, they will end up working in a relatively poorly managed business. They never learn what really good looks like. Whereas if you go into an environment where those skills and practices are more embedded into the ether of how business is done, then you just pick them up, and it's almost like a chicken and egg sort of situation. Now, we are, of course, I'm involved in a charity called Be the Business, which is trying to change this, is trying to engage smaller and medium-sized businesses to improve their productivity through improved leadership and management skills and practices, as well as digital adoption, which is another critical driver of productivity growth. But it's really quite hard work. The ESCO, what's it called? The Center for Excellence for Economic and Statistics measurement thing. I'm sure everybody listening to this knows what I mean, and I can't just remember the exact name of the research unit. And ONS did some really interesting work with Be the Business at one point, trying to offer these free coaching courses to businesses to say, we can help you, improve your productivity, and we'll do it for free. And you would hope that a lot of businesses take up that offer, but actually I think it was something like 1% of all the businesses who were offered this free training and free coaching were actually interested and actually took it up and actually got it delivered. Once you get those things delivered, you can then show through careful evaluations that they do actually work, but they take a long time to work. And the challenge is really getting more businesses interested in them in the first place.
Yeah, no, it's good. And good you mentioned the kind of a potential solution to the challenge. And a lot of the time you think about what government should be doing something, and that sounds like it's not necessarily government driven. It could be government kind of supported or sponsored, but it's more of kind of a businesses they need to engage. I mean, the apprenticeship is another good point, because other countries have a different structure in terms of education as well, which might help us, where people actually might start actually operating in the working environment slightly earlier. That might actually facilitate that learning point. So by the time you reach your mid-20s or early 30s, when you are in a proper business, then you already had experience, and therefore you may have seen some good and bad practices that went from a management point of view. I mean, going to the point about solution, anything else that you think, either because you've seen in other countries that work, or things that could be done on a relatively, almost kind of, what are the easy wins actually to change that kind of culture or kind of management practices?
So I don't think there are any easy wins. Like if there were, we'd have sort of thought of them 10 years ago and would have implemented them. And as an economist, one of the first things that comes to mind is incentives. I think incentives do work over a very long period of time. They sort of recarve the landscape of how businesses operate, but they have to be there for a while and they have to be embedded. Otherwise, a kind of back and forth of changing incentives actually creates a lot of uncertainty, which is worse, because under uncertainty, businesses have less of an incentive to invest, or they certainly will fall into the trap of risk aversion and not necessarily do anything while they wait out for this policy landscape to stabilize. I think anything we can do to improve creative destruction and business dynamism, and that may well be actually increasing the standards or expectations of businesses, reducing various kind of ways in which we make it easier for them in some areas, because that should push the standards up to a point across the board, as opposed to just for one or two companies. And it's not enough if we change one or two companies. We really do need to change practically all of our 5.5 million businesses to drive aggregate productivity. and taking then a huge step back from the whole set of issues around just management and leadership and management practices. Clearly, the sort of absolutely smoking gun in terms of what's causing our productivity to be so low is low business investments.
Yeah.
And I think there are one or two things that can be done, none of them easy wins, that can encourage business investment. And the first one, I think, is the planning reforms the government is thinking about. Quite often when you dig deeper into why is it that businesses are not investing, it is because they can't, because there's some kind of regulation stopping them. And so I think that will help. I also have looked at the data a little bit on housing. And I think there's an issue around agglomerations in the UK where some of the places that could be growing a lot faster and could be improving productivity and could be sucking in employment so that we, in aggregate, get more productive people into more productive places. Some of those places are very constrained by housing. So the labour market isn't contributing as much as it could to our productivity growth. And we do have big skills mismatches in this country. So that would be another area to look into. Public sector investment is critical because especially if it relieves bottlenecks. So, for example, back to this point about agglomeration, if one of the reasons some of our cities aren't as vibrant and as productive as they could be is because the labour markets are not as dynamic because people can't get to work or your customers are too far away or whatever it is, too far away time-wise, not miles-wise, then relieving those kind of transport bottlenecks or any kind of other infrastructure bottlenecks is really quite a big deal for productivity growth. And the final thing, sorry, Philip. Yeah, final thing I was going to say, which may or may not want to come back to, is this point about digital adoption. Like, why is it that so many businesses are still not taking up some of the really basic digital tools that are out there to improve their productivity and some basic business processes like customer service or customer relationship management or accounting or what have you? And those things, when done, they actually clearly improve productivity. And so improving digital adoption amongst our business population would also be important.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are kind of excellent points. And I think the digital and linked towards the AI issues will open up kind of a bit of a Pandora's box, and we could be spending a lot of time talking about digital. But your points around agglomeration, housing, and to a certain extent, the public investment in infrastructure, but also particularly about planning, is something that came up in a previous show that we did with Sam Bowman, where we had this article with some colleagues' kind of foundation, and those were the two of the three key points that he had in there: the planning and the kind of agglomeration, in particular the mismatch between where actually the activity is and where people live, and that was an obstacle actually to development. So he kind of resonates with that. One point that you haven't mentioned, and I'm not sure, but I've seen sometimes mentioned, not necessarily just for UK, but in general for Europe as well, and the difference with the United States is around the funding and the financing of kind of activities, in terms of the US more kind of equity-based and kind of Europe more kind of debt and bond-based. In a sense, in the US, therefore, there is a little bit more kind of availability of capital because actually people are more kind of willing to go and invest, and it's easier actually to a certain extent. And it was partly actually the finance and funding, something that both Let and Draghi actually mentioned in their report related to Europe, not necessarily to the UK. Is there something you see in the UK as well, that the kind of the financing of firms is a bit of an issue?
So it's tricky. I have seen some of it, but I'm not sure that I've got to the bottom of it, and let me explain why. Most people who talk about access to finance in the UK conclude that it's not an issue about supply, it's an issue about demand.
Okay.
So when you go and talk to entrepreneurs, they don't want equity because it'll dilute their own ownership of their business. They're used to using bank loans, and that's what they kind of apply for. They're not necessarily able to articulate a story to a financier about how investing in some more intangible capital, such as innovation or ICT or AI or what have you, would boost their business, and therefore why they still deserve to get the money. So there's quite a lot of factors on the demand side of the equation, which mean that businesses are just not even asking for the funding because they're not looking to grow, et cetera, et cetera. There is some evidence, of course, as well on the supply side that there isn't enough risk capital, that it's not evenly distributed around the country. An awful lot of it tends to be in London and in the Golden Triangle. And the financiers, whoever they are, whether they're VC funds or they are, other kind of investment vehicles, because we don't have the scale of the US market, for example, that they don't tend to have quite the same level of specialization and therefore capability to assess proposals. And indeed, from their front, the ability and willingness to take risk. So it's probably, again, one of those chicken and egg problems that you need both lots of capital looking for lots of opportunities with lots of experience and expertise and kind of smart capital and patient capital. But then, for it to land anywhere, you do need businesses on the ground who are saying, hey, I want that capital. I want to grow. I have this idea. I want to go international. I want to invest in this or that innovation. And if you have neither, then it's really quite difficult to get it going. Having said all of that, Filippo, actually, if we take a huge big step back, we always berate the UK for lack of unicorns and lack of scale-up businesses and whatever. But from what I know, we're actually the second best in the country, in the world, after the US. Yes. So we will never match Silicon Valley or Boston, Kendall Square, these kinds of places. They're just like a massively different country with a big market size, with a history and kind of ecosystem of both supply and demand for funding and a kind of innovation culture. I don't think we will be able to match, but relative to other European countries, we're not doing bad actually on scale-ups and on unicorns. In fact, I think we're probably the best on unicorns in Europe. So we often compare ourselves to the US, which is great because, we should aspire to be great, but we shouldn't beat ourselves up either because we're actually doing pretty well.
Very good, and it's always good to bring in some positive kind of vision. Now, my last question is more the one I ask a lot of people on the podcast, whether they are more kind of optimist or pessimist or neutral maybe around actually productivity. Normally the question is around global or the US, but considering we talked a lot about the UK, or probably just focus on the UK, do you see actually productivity increasing? Obviously, we've seen a resurgence of productivity to a certain extent post-COVID in the United States. Do we see the same actually happen in the UK? So it will be higher than the last decade or the pre-COVID decade?
So I used to be such a huge optimist, Filippo, but I'm afraid I've turned into a productivity pessimist. Let me give you a couple of reasons why. Well, first of all, if I just look at the data, the UK's productivity in the third quarter of this year, in 2024, was exactly the same as in the third quarter of 2021. So in 3 years, I understand there was COVID and we've bounced back, but nothing like as much as the US or some other countries. And so we're sort of flatlining. The second reason is that I keep going back to the reason why productivity growth and our productivity level, and those are obviously part of the sort of same equation, why it's so dismal is because we're not seeing enough investment. And if I look at capital stock per hour worked as a measure of how much capital do our people have to make them productive in the workplace, the UK has 55% of the same level as the US, Netherlands, Germany, France. So we have kind of 45% missing, and the UK's capital stock is £5 trillion. So that means we've got £4 trillion of missing capital. Now, we're not going to make that up in a year or even 10 years. And I'm not sure where we're ever going to get that capital from and how we're going to get the incentives right in order to actually invest in it. So I'm worried about us not having really cracked this investment problem properly. Now, there are things that are going in the right direction. I think, I've mentioned them: digital adoption, public sector investment in infrastructure, planning reform, and up to a point, actually demographics might work in our favor, because if there are fewer people available to work, businesses are going to have to improve productivity. But in terms of the actual numbers of productivity growth that we get out of that, I just don't see how we're going to get close to like a 2 or 3% number anytime soon. And so we might be in the kind of 0.5 to 1% productivity growth territory, which is not great.
Okay, I will kind of grasp those one or two little lights that you threw in there in terms of optimism, and trying to remain optimist. But I think it's been great actually talking to you, Tera, particularly because you bring in a lot of all the time kind of analysis and data to substantiate your argument, which is great. And in fact, for all our listeners, if they don't know you, they should kind of follow you on LinkedIn, because you regularly actually post incredibly great stats and chart. I love charts, so I love actually seeing all that data. And you have, I think, the hashtag data is beautiful, and I agree, is absolutely fantastic. And it's the only way actually we can kind of learn as well and then improve. So if you for all the listeners, if you don't know Tera, follow on LinkedIn. And almost every day there is a new piece of data, which is great. And it's been a pleasure having you with us today. And thank you for joining our show.
Thank you, Filippo. The pleasure was mine.